Today we're reviewing the Intel Core Ultra 5 245K. That is the actual name. You can think of this like a 15600K, which, to be fair, is not a much better name. So the 245K, it's $310 part, 6P cores, 8 E cores, 14 threads. There's no SMT or hyperthreading on it. And this is going to be a really short and simple review today, at least by our standards. The 285K review went up as well. That is massive, and it explores a lot of really important topics with how the power is being routed through the motherboard that we tested with, and goes into 24-pin power, ATX 12 volt being drawn there, and some other stuff too. But ultimately our conclusion, which you do need to watch that review for all the backstory, but the important parts were product's not ready for launch, has a lot of really critical bugs right now that are being found in the reviews process, which is a terrible time to find bugs, because that means these parts are already out there. They're already in retailers' hands. And so motherboards, for example, that have issues, they're going to ship with the problematic BIOSes where they exist, such as ours, where features aren't enabled properly like they're supposed to be. But anyway, all that's in the 285K review. That part hasn't changed. So all that still applies here. We're just not going to recap it again because it's the same. What is different is the pricing, the value positioning. Intel and its big Arrow Lake claims are that efficiency's improved and power consumption's down. For the most part, these are both accurate statements with some key details there that we'll go over again. Now, key comparisons against modern CPUs would include AMD's entire X3D lineup, such as especially the 5700 X3D. So if you're on AM4, that's still a phenomenal upgrade path. And then additionally, the 9600X is kind of in the same price territory. Intel's prior generation parts have gotten cheaper as well. So we'll get into all that, but today we are applying it to the 245K, looking at gaming, production, power, and making some determinations on if it's worth it. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermaltake and the Tower 600 case. The Tower 600 is a vertical case design with Thermaltake's unique showcase presentation, which stands out further with its separate chassis stand kit that rotates the case for an angled showpiece. The Tower 600 is heavily ventilated around the sides, has a ton of radiator support, including up to 420mm solutions, and offers 2 GPU mounting options for display and cooling optimization. It also comes in colors not commonly seen in cases. Learn more about the Tower 600 at the link in the description below. All right, so again, this is going to be a hyper-condensed review by our standards, the 285K review. Just to emphasize, you do need to check it out if you want the full picture of everything, because we're not going to repeat ourselves with everything. So let's start with the price comparison. These prices were taken in the run-up before the reviews going live. The prices may have changed by now, but at least at the time we're working on this, here's how it lines up. Prices for both Intel's 13th and 14th series CPUs have dropped recently, as have some of AMD's Zen 5 CPUs. The 14700K is as cheap as $350 now, which makes it a direct alternative to the 245K. Despite buying into an older platform, there's maybe an argument to be made there. It has at least gotten microcode updates that should resolve the major concerns, but as we said in the 285K review, it's not going to be 100% clear until later because these things manifest over time. The 14600K is $225 to $250 now. It's about the same price as AMD's 9600X. The 13600K is dwindling in supply, about $225 lately. The 12900K is also cheaper than the 245K, and despite being a pretty old platform, it's maybe worth looking at. Technically, it's $280 to $300. We've seen Newegg do some pretty big discounts, though. AMD's 5700X 3D is around $210 to $230 now, making it a key upgrade pathway for AM4 users. And then the 7800X 3D is priced out of this territory, up at $480 typically. And keep in mind that a 98X 3D, or whatever they end up calling it, is due out November 7th. Here's a slide showing the basic specs from Intel. The 285K is a 24-thread part, has 8 P cores, 16 E cores. Intel ditched hyper-threading, so it's just the 2 core counts combined for thread count. The 245K is a 14-thread part. It has an advertised boost up to 5.2 gigahertz. Overall, Intel is heavily focusing on the power consumption reductions and efficiency improvements. But in addition to pre-launch issues that, again, lead us to the conclusion of not ready for launch, don't buy it right now, the 245K will also see some of what the 285K saw, which is in some areas we saw a regression in performance. So the newer CPUs, if they drop power consumption, part of that is also dropping the performance. So we have this really weird mix where Intel is conceding the thing they have obsessed over for years, often sort of in a flawed way, but which is leadership performance. And they don't have that for the most part. There's a couple areas that are pretty competitive, like in Blender rendering, but in gaming, Not even close right now. It's all X3D all the time. That's kind of it. So anyway, the regression in performance complicates efficiency. Efficiency is a calculation involving the power consumed during that specific task and the result. And so you need those two numbers to determine how efficient a thing is. Sometimes you normalize for work as well. We do that in some of these tests, but it's not a clean improvement all the time because of this regressive performance in a lot of these cases. So let's start with the efficiency. And again, for all the detail on how we're doing this now, because we've changed the testing methodology, check the last two videos. The most important part is that ASUS is directing some power through the ATX 12 volt cables on the 24-pin connectors now for some boards, so we can't rely purely on EPS 12 volt. There's a lot of nuance to that. We're going to leave all that detail out here on the assumption that you get it in the longer review. In 7-zip compression efficiency testing, we measured the 245K with EPS 12 volt and ATX 12 volt at 108.1 watts on average, which produced a MIPS per watt rating of 1130.6, or in other words, 1130.6 million instructions per joule. The 245K outranked the 285K's efficiency in this same test, meaning that the 285K is beyond the optimum point in the curve for efficiency. It's still improved over the preceding 14900K though. The 14600K scored 768.3 MIPS per watt here at 166.5 watts, so the 245K is improved in efficiency. The 245K's performance in compression MIPS is actually lower than the 14600K's, but its power consumption dropped so drastically, even with ATX 12 volt measured, that it has measuredly improved in efficiency at 47% more efficient than the 14600K. Adding the 5 volt line includes I/O and so isn't perfect, but even that is more efficient. We talk about why we add both in the 285K review for some of these tests. AMD remains the leader with the 9600X at 1152.8 MIPS per watt, with the 5700X 3D at 1281 and the 7700 non-X at 1436.2. 7-zip decompression uses power from the same test since we combine them, but it has different scores. In this one, the 245K held a score of 1090 MIPS per watt. Its actual MIPS throughput, which we'll show later, is significantly behind the 14600K, so the efficiency percentage uplift is dragged down by regressive performance, despite the total power reduction. The improvement over the 14600K's 821.9 result is 32.6%. The closest score in MIPS throughput to this is the 5800X3D, which is just outside of error. The 5800X3D and 245K are therefore completing about the same output and are normalized in this way, allowing the 5800X3D a staggering lead of 28% more efficiency than the 245K. In Baldur's Gate 3 efficiency, the 245K ran at 71.5 watts and scored 1.3 FPS per watt. That has it tied in efficiency with the R7 7700, and it tied the 9700X, which wasn't distant. These three CPUs can be looked at as nearly work normalized or FPS normalized, in addition to scoring the same efficiency. The 5800X3D has a substantial frame rate lead and runs at only 65.7 watts, giving it a 1.8 FPS per watt result at 38.5% more efficient than the 245K. The 5700X3D has a larger lead with its 51.1 watt result and is also typically cheaper, though on an old platform now with old I/O support. Still, it's impressive. Comparing the 245K to the 14600K, the lead is 44% uplift in efficiency compared to the 0.9 FPS per watt result of the 14600K also had a slightly lower frame rate in this one. In Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail, the 245K ran at 4.3 FPS per watt and 51.8 watts, putting it behind the 9600X, which has a significantly higher frame rate but about a 10 to 11 watt higher power consumption. It's also ahead of the 14600K. The improvement over the 14600K's 3.6 FPS per watt result is 19%. The 5700X3D crushes here, up at 7.7 FPS per watt, and leading the 245K by 80% with thanks to its lower power and its higher frame rate. As for why the lead for the 245K over the 14600K is not as significant as elsewhere, it's because the frame rate comes down for Arrow Lake here. It's just not as good. Dawntrail, Final Fantasy in general, is problematic for this platform. Stellaris shows us simulations per watt hour, so higher is better despite the test being in seconds baseline with lower being better. We've done some math to convert it to simulations per watt hour. In this test, the 245K ran at 53.5 watts and completes 1.9 simulations per watt hour. That has it about tied with the 5800X3D, which likewise is roughly tied in power consumption. So these are good direct comparisons. The 5700X3D's power consumption drop benefits it greatly here, although it slows down in simulation time. Its score is 2.4 simulations per watt hour, or an improvement over the 245K of 26%. Against the 14600K, the 245K improves by 46%. This is one of the stronger ones. The 14600K is slower in simulation time here, contributing to that gap. We'll look at maximum single core frequency under a Cinebench workload first, just to verify that the CPU does what Intel advertises. The 285K plotted at about 5700 MHz during this workload, with the 14900K at 6000 MHz. The 14600K ran a maximum of about 5300 MHz at any given period, with the new 245K at 5200 MHz max. This is what Intel claims is the maximum for the 245K, so that's the bare minimum bar to clear, and they have at least done that. This chart checks the P-core boosting behavior in an all-core workload. We measured the 285K at 5400 MHz on average here. The 14900K's most recent result fluctuated around 5100 to 5200 MHz. The 14600K has a flat 5300 MHz P-core average from the original review, and the 245K plots at 5000 MHz for P-core boosting. Dragon's Dogma 2 is up now. In this one, the 245K ran a baseline of 95 FPS average. That allowed it a slight lead over the similarly priced 9700X at 91 FPS. The 245K also technically outperforms the 14600K, although realistically they're about the same. The cheaper and low-power 5700X3D outperforms the 245K by 8.4% with 103 FPS average. That's a considerable lead considering the price and the older platform with the X3D refreshed part. Moving to the 285K from the 245K yields a 9.8% uplift, but you should watch our 285K review for more nuance on that. The price jump is so significant that, especially for gaming-first builds, the 7800X3D would make more sense for most people than the 285K, so if you're considering jumping that much in price, you should look at other CPUs. APO did nothing here. F124 is next. The 245K ran at 307 FPS average here. That has the 9700X 23% ahead at 378 FPS, the 5700X 3D at 16% ahead at 355 FPS, and the 14600K 4% ahead with a 319 FPS average. Intra-architecture, the 285K offers a 12% uplift at 344 FPS. Notables that the 245K outperforms include the 12600K from 2021 at 13.7% ahead. APO actually does something in this game, sometimes sort of. We talked about the exciting 1.2% gain in the 14900K, which we're sure the entire comments section will be completely flooded with since it's so impressive. No doubt many of you have scrolled down, and immediately right now you have begun typing things like, wow, I can't believe how many fractions of a percent over 1.0 APO gives us.
You can literally see it.
Well, prepare your keyboards for comments. The 245K gained 1.8 FPS average from APO. Some of that might even not be margin of error. Groundbreaking stuff. It's almost 0.6%. Because APO is so impressive, you can understand why we decided not to bother dedicating time running it for the 1440p test of F1. We obviously just didn't want to embarrass everything else here. At 1440p, the chart becomes truncated by the resolution increase. The end result is largely the same lower down the stack, though. The 245K remains outflanked by the 13600K and the 14600K above it, and encroached upon by the 12600K below it. These CPUs were already mostly CPU bound, and so they remain about the same here. Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail is up now. At 1080p, the 245K ran at 220 FPS average. This allowed the 9700X a staggering lead of 41% for a similar price. The 7700X is cheaper than the 245K at $280 at the time of writing, and it produces a 265 FPS average result. Against other CPUs, the 5700X3D outperforms the 245K by 37%, up at 301 FPS, with the 14600K leading it by 12% with its 248 FPS, and the 285K leading by 22% at 270 FPS. In our 285K review, we noted that Final Fantasy is one of Intel's worst generational titles between the 14 series and the Ultra 200 CPUs. As for APO, we were not able to pick up a difference outside of usual margins. The APO on result is 0.77% ahead of APO off, which is cool. Moving on, at 1440p, the 9700X's lead is cut down to only, and that only is doing some very heavy lifting here, 22%. This is because of other limitations from the resolution change, but it shows that even at 1440p, Even with the GPU bind stepping in a bit, the 245K is disadvantaged. Baldur's Gate 3 is up now, tested in the densely populated city center in Act 3. The 245K ran at 92 to 93 FPS average here. As a result, the 9700X improves upon its frame rate by 7%, the 5700X3D's 111 FPS result improves by 20%, and the 14600K is behind the 245K and alongside the 9600X. The 245K leads the 14600K by 6.2% here. This is at least better than we saw with the 14900K and the 285K gaps. The 14900K was also encroaching on memory limitations, as evidenced by the 13700K, 13900K bouncing off the same limit, and proven by the 285K with DDR5 8600 pushing ahead. We talked about that in the 285K review. You should check it out. As for the 285K's like-for-like lead over the 245K, that's 8% at 100 FPS average. Stellaris is up next for something different. This one gives us simulation time in seconds rather than frame rate per second, so it's more base metric of time. The 245K required 34.9 seconds to complete the simulation, with APO doing nothing for simulation time. The result has the 245K just ahead of the 5800X3D, behind the 7700 Non-X, and behind the new 9600X. Zen 5 does well on this particular benchmark. Against the 14600K, the 245K benefits from a simulation time requirement reduction of 4.6%. The 245K also leads the 5700X3D with a simulation time reduction of 8.9%. The 5700X3D falls back from its reduced frequency here. The 285K reduces the time requirement from the 245K to 32.5 seconds, or reducing the time required by about 7%. Rainbow Six Siege is next. In the 285K review, we showed this frame time plot, which we're showing again now because it illustrates some behavior where it appears as if frame time pacing is a little more tuned on the 12 to 14 series CPUs than most of the others we test, including AMD and this one. Here's the chart for the 245K. The 245K ran at about 476 FPS average, allowing the 9700X a staggering 31% lead at 621 FPS. The 5700X3D ran at 526 FPS, or a 10% lead. Next is the 14600K at 517 FPS for a 9% advantage over the 245K. Intra-architecture, the 285K leads the 245K by a noteworthy 22.6%, although we still don't recommend it against alternatives mentioned in the 285K review. It's at least a real gap, though, for the price gap. That's important. Toggling APO didn't change the 285K or the 245K, though that's not shown on this chart because it's pointless. Loads remain reduced on some architectures, including Arrow Lake. Loading screen field is up now. In this game, the 245K ran at 121 FPS average. The 9700X held a 117 FPS result, within about 3% or so of the 245K, but technically behind. The 5700X3D is also slightly behind at 118. Intel's own 14600K breaks away at 127 FPS, a 5% uplift over the 245K. Finally, the new 285K is about 18% ahead of the 245K, similar to the gains we saw in Rainbow Six. Toggling APO had no appreciable impact here. Time to move into production testing. Like with the 285K, we're going to keep this short and focused, but dense with charts. In Blender with CPU rendering, the 245K required 12.6 minutes to complete a render of a single frame from the GN video intro animation. That has it about a minute faster than the 14600K, reducing the time requirement by 7.4%. The 245K is beaten by the 14700K at 9.5 minutes, or a 24% reduction in time required. The 14700K is $350 as we write this, which is a 13% increase in price over the 245K, if you want to look at it that way. The 285K was a relatively impressive performer in this test as well, with only the 9950X ahead of it. This is one of the few where Arrow Lake does okay in competitive scenarios. File compression with 7-zip has the 245K at 122,000 MIPS, landing it behind the 13600K and 14600K. The 13600K improves upon the 245K by 4.1%. The 245K is just ahead of the 7700X at 9700X, and the 7800X3D isn't far back, but the extra cache doesn't benefit it in our production suite. The 285K with DDR5 8600 illustrated that this particular test benefits from better memory, providing a large uplift over the baseline 170K MIPS that tied the stock setup with the 14700K. Decompression doesn't benefit nearly as much from the memory improvement, but does benefit from the extra threads found on some CPUs. The 14900K to 285K comparison is an easy example of this, as is the presence of both of AMD's 16-core SKUs that are kind of current, at least, at the top of the chart. The 245K lands far down the chart, just ahead of the 5800X3D, and behind the 5800X and 7800X3D. The 5800X illustrates that the higher frequency is more beneficial to this test than the extra cache on the 58X3D, and the 245K ends up beaten by the 14600K at 137,000 MIPS, an increase of 16%, with the 13600K similarly advantaged but older. The 285K's 193K MIPS result has it 64% ahead of the 245K. This is a similar lead to what we see from the 14900K over the 14600K previously. Ultimately, the 245K is beaten by several CPUs that are direct competitors here, including the 7700 Non-X, the preceding 13700K and 14600K, the 7800X2D, and the 9700X. Chromium code compiles up now. We explained the memory capacity change for high-end parts and the frequency limit on the 9950X in our 285K review. In this one, the 245K required 134 minutes to complete the compile. That's tied with the 14600K. The time requirement reduction for the 245K from the 9700X is 10% here, with the latter at 149 minutes. It's also predictably better than the 7800X3D. The 13700K reduces the compile time to 105 minutes, or a reduction in time of 21%. Using the Puget suite, Adobe Premiere lands at 9824 points for the 245K. That has the new CPU sandwiched by the 7900 and 7900X above, and the 13600K and 14600K below, with a more meaningful gap over the 9700X and 7800X3D. The $250 i7-13700K gives the 245K a serious run for its higher cost, though, at 10,616 points. The 285K posts a large uplift over the 245K at 15% higher in score. It's not the biggest change we've seen between the two, but it's still meaningful. This test in general is one of the more favorable for Arrow Lake with the 285K. That's true, too, of the 245K in some ways, but there are better value alternatives like the 13700K, especially now that Intel claims the microcode issue is fixed. Realistically, there's not a great way to prove that until we're a couple years down the line and we see what happens. Adobe Photoshop is dominated by AMD in the current iteration of the software in the Puget test. The 245K and 285K are far down the list, both behind the 13700K, 14700K, and almost everything modern from AMD. It's not much of a contest here. AMD just dominates in this test right now. So here's how it all breaks down. First off, we think you should wait a week and see what happens when AMD launches its 9000X3D part. They haven't named it right now, at least. I think it might be named when this video goes up, but probably 9800 or something X3D. That's supposed to come out November 7th, and while waiting a week, also you can observe how Arrow Lake may get improvements from Intel. They're supposed to issue more statements on some of the bugs that have been found by various reviewers during the review process, and we'll see if they actually make good on that in a meaningful amount of time. So that out of the way, Intel has in fact reduced the power consumption, and it has improved the efficiency sometimes in very impressive ways, which they've needed. That doesn't, however, mean that it makes sense to purchase it. Even catching the ATX 12-volt power changes on our Asus board, the CPU is lower power consumption and higher efficiency, even when it sometimes regresses in performance. Some games saw improved performance and lower power consumption, like Stellaris, which resulted in a larger uplift than areas where we saw heavy performance regression, like Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail, as compared to things like the 14600K. In production workloads, we saw regression from the 14600K and 7-zip compression, though it still beats the 9700X here, so at least that's something. And in decompression and a few other areas. In Photoshop, the 245K improved on the 14600K technically, but AMD still holds a massive lead in that particular test. Premiere was a cleaner victory for the 245K, improving on the 14600K and reducing power draw. Blender looks better for something like the 285K overall, where it's up with the 9950X. And the 245K did okay in Blender as well. And then gaming had the 245K down around the 7700 levels in Baldur's Gate 3 and ahead of the 9600X, but getting absolutely crushed by the 5700X3D, the 5600X3D, obviously the 7800X3D. And although the 245K's relative positioning against the 9600X and the 14600K flip-flopped in some games, like in F1, where it was remarkably non-competitive, the 245K that is, the global constant was that X3D outperformed the 245K always. And that's a problem for Intel, because this is the type of CPU that is targeted at the gaming audience. Heavy production users are probably looking for higher end parts where it can be afforded. And if you can't afford a higher end part for a heavy production workload, then there are lots of other alternatives, especially last generation, that are comparable in price and still very competitive. So there's kind of options on all sides of the 245K that do not necessarily include it. Fortunately for Intel, AMD doesn't have any modern platform X3D CPUs that are in this direct price range. The 7800X3D is priced out of this class. Until it replaces the 5700X3D in price with an AM5 part, Intel will at least have fully modernized I/O, despite its disadvantages elsewhere, like in raw performance. as compared to something like an AM4 platform build, which also is just building into a close to EOL ecosystem. In theory, they're still making CPUs for it, so who the hell knows? I'll be covering an AM4 CPU in like 15 years and no one's gonna be surprised. So anyway, that's kind of where it lines up. Intel's strongest argument right now is efficiency. The problem is, like we talked about with the 285K review, in gaming, AMD is more efficient and better with the X3D parts and a lot of its other components too. In non-gaming, it's more efficient. Now, it's not necessarily better, so efficiency again, because it includes performance and power draw, something like 7800 X2D can be a lower performing part in something like 7-zip, compression, decompression, but still be more efficient just because the power is so low. So it all comes back down to where does this CPU slot into the market right now? We look at value always, and our answer for that is nowhere. We don't have a place for Arrow Lake right now. We think you should wait, definitely wait for Intel to get its shit together and patch the issues. Like again, it has acknowledged them, it's putting statements out, whatever, but it's got to stop doing this with the unforced errors and launching things in this way. It looks like complete chaos over there. So to quickly recap a few things, there's too much fierce competition, too much price competition. We did the power cost savings calculations in the 285K review, so even looking at the efficiency argument purely and the power consumption argument, and it still takes several years, like depending on your power cost. If you're at 50 cents a kilowatt hour, which is really high compared to what we pay, then that would still be something like 3 years of 8 hours a day gaming in a CPU-heavy game, non-stop, to equate the difference of a 285K to a 14700K sort of price savings in power cost excess. That's what you would need to do to make that value make sense. And then again, like we said, the environmental stewardship angle is addressed with if you're gaming by AMD because it's lower power anyway. And so that's the challenge for Intel. A 245K is largely targeted at the gaming market. It has production sort of crossover in use cases. There's some areas where it looks okay in those, but we don't recommend this right now. And one, they need to stop shipping bugs. Two, it is embattled on all sides by similarly priced competing options. That's it. So thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. We have a ton of stuff coming up as always. And the 285K review, again, I really just want to sort of emphasize it because the power testing we did in that, it was really fun. Learned a lot and found some cool things out. We're going to apply it going forward. So thanks for watching. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, like by buying one of our silicone soldering mats that I have on the table here in front of me, one of our PC building anti-static mod mats, and check back for the 9000 X3D reviews in a week or so. We'll see you all next time.